In my last video, I spoke on the differences between Eve's unique role in the Garden of Eden, as well as Adam's, and how it was different than those who came after them. And I called those differences a disjoint so as to highlight how the law manifested differently in their lives than it did in those who came after them, in the lives of, say, Jesus or David. And the fact that Jesus and David could abide by what that law actually says without violating its terms, even though it looked different than the way Adam abided by it, proves that it's invalid to require of men only Adam's particular way of living it out, when other godly men abided by the law just as easily, even if it didn't look the same as Adam's. And that's why I was bringing up those disjoints, to show that other godly men were carrying out the law and the mandate in Genesis 2:24 just in a different way. And that's what I want the listener to know. I'm trying to remind the listener that they all did abide by the law. There was no exception to the law being drawn, or any exception to abiding by the terms of the law in any of those circumstances. If you look at what the mandate in Genesis 2:24 actually says, the wording it uses, you'll see that Adam, Jesus, and David never do go outside of the boundaries of what it actually says. The disjoints between them, between their individual circumstances in life, made abiding by it look different in their individual lives, but that's the whole point. That it is wrong to hold anyone of their particular ways of abiding by that law as a standard to hold over the heads of men, instead of holding the law itself as the standard and what it actually says. Because the law has plenty of room to be followed by everyone and their unique individual circumstances in life. All right, I want to move on to the next objection that the critic will level, which deals with Genesis 2:24, and that is that it is impossible for a man to be married to more than one woman because marriage is defined as two becoming one flesh. In Matthew 19, Jesus is talking about divorce with the Pharisees. And when on the issue, Jesus quotes from the Genesis 2:24 passage that we had just gone over. And in his quote, he includes a particular phrase coming from the Greek version of the recorded story, which includes the phrase, "And the two shall become one flesh." Pastors and teachers everywhere have made their attempts at squeezing out of this phrase as much as they possibly can in order to refute polygamy, as if to imply Jesus was giving a lesson talking about the evils of polygamy, except that Jesus wasn't giving a lesson on polygamy at all. The entire discussion that Jesus is having with the Pharisees is surrounding the issue of divorce. In fact, after Jesus says, quote, "the two shall become one flesh," he says, therefore. He says, therefore, which is a word to key the listeners in on what Jesus is actually drawing from the aforementioned text. He says, therefore, what God has joined together, let no man separate. So you see, Jesus was drawing from the one flesh phrase a lesson against unjustified divorce, not a lesson against polygamy. Jesus was teaching on the permanent nature of marriage, not on the number of marriages a man can have. That's why I say that teachers try to squeeze what they can out of it, because it requires them to squeeze Jesus' words right out of the context and right away from the issue that Jesus was trying to address. Now, I'm sure someone could think that, how can I be consistent in my approach, especially when I just finished talking about how even subtle nuances and implications of a text can carry authority. Because the critic's argument develops like this. They'll say, even though Jesus was addressing divorce, he talks of marriage as being two who become one flesh. And that must have implications for polygamy, because Jesus didn't say marriage is three becoming one flesh, or four or five. The critic will say, so having more than two in one marriage is outside the bounds of what Jesus describes as marriage. A man is not one flesh with two different women. He's one flesh with only one other woman, because it takes two to become one flesh. So they'll say something like that. I think the critic would surprisingly be pleased to know that I happen to also believe that marriage is between one man and one woman. Now, I suppose there may be people out there who would argue that two becoming one flesh does not exclude the possibility of three or four becoming one flesh, because as we learned in the last lesson, the word only is not employed here, and only two not being employed doesn't exclude the possibility of others. However, I personally do not believe that 3 or 4 can become one flesh, because I think that the term one flesh carries with it sexual connotations, among other things. But the connotations that deal with the actual act of sex, and as the Bible likes to phrase it, going into a woman. So physically speaking, anatomically speaking, a man can't actually go into more than one woman at the same time, while also realizing that a man cannot beget a child with 2 different wives. He can only beget a child with one other woman. You see, I'm appealing here to the natural order of sex itself and how it was designed. I'm appealing to the function of sex when I hold that position. But I don't want to spend too much time unpacking all the other illusions that the one flesh term has. I only wanted to bring it up to show that I can consistently hold that view and hold to the belief also that marriage is between one man and one woman, while also believing that biblical polygamy is not wrong. Because it's well within the boundaries of the law and within the boundaries of 2 becoming one flesh to say that a man can be one flesh with his one wife and also can be one flesh with his other wife. And in each of those cases, it is 2 who become one flesh. So that each marriage the man has in his multiple marriages is a case of 2 becoming one flesh, as opposed to 3 or 4 becoming one flesh, you see. So marriage is not defined as being composed of a man and 2 or 3 wives, but rather a man has several different marriages and with several different of his wives. I would imagine a critic would complain to me at this point and accuse me of playing word games or something like that in order to dodge the issue at hand, except I'm not dodging the issue, because I haven't at all redefined anything differently than what my critic already agrees with in terms of the definition of marriage. And I'm holding to the position that I've been holding to since the beginning, of which is that a man can have and maintain more than one of those marriages. So the issue isn't that I'm dodging anything. The issue is that the critic thinks it's impossible for a man to be one flesh with one woman and also one flesh with another woman, even though there is nothing at all in the phrase 2 shall become one flesh that contradicts that notion. And furthermore, that position is a position that Paul himself teaches to the church in Corinth. If you look in 1 Corinthians 6, verses 15 and 16, Paul says this: "Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Shall I then take the members of Christ and make them members of a prostitute? Never. Or do you not know that he who is joined to a prostitute becomes one body with her? For as it is written, the 2 will become one flesh." Paul quotes directly from the exact same source Jesus did when Jesus taught on divorce. Except when Paul draws a lesson on it, it does have something to do with polygamy. Because when Paul forbids a man from sleeping with a prostitute, he warns that if he does, he'll become one flesh with her. If that man is married, it means that he has become one flesh with his wife and also has become one flesh with the prostitute. This also means that the prostitute herself, she has become one flesh with one customer and has also become one flesh with a different customer also. So for the critic to claim that it's impossible for a man to be one flesh with one woman and one flesh with a different woman is to teach against what Paul is warning against here. It is to say that Paul's warning carries no merit or authority, which is the wrong side to be on in this discussion. If the definition of marriage is one man and one woman becoming one flesh, then it is possible for a man to maintain multiple marriages or maintaining multiple one-flesh relationships. Because that's the exact definition Paul himself is teaching in 1 Corinthians 6 when he warns against adding any additional one-flesh relationships. And in this video, I just want to note, for accuracy's sake, that Paul is not teaching against adding any more one-flesh relationships altogether. What he's warning against, what he's teaching against, is having any of those one-flesh relationships be with a prostitute.